The next story is really, really disturbing, and I want to warn you ahead of time that the video you're about to see is incredibly graphic. A man named Randy Cox from Connecticut was arrested on gun charges on June the 19th. New Haven police officers placed Cox in the back of a van, handcuffed and with no seatbelt on. The police officer driving the van slammed on his brakes, and Cox went flying, hitting his head against the side of the van. And now Cox is paralyzed from the chest down and on a ventilator. Civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump is on Cox's legal team and said Cox is paralyzed because of the, quote, actions and inactions taken by the New Haven Police Department. Joining us to discuss, Mark Claxton from the Black Law Enforcement Alliance and Eddie Glaude, MSNBC contributor and professor and chair of the African American Studies Department at Princeton. He also has a brand new podcast I highly recommend called History is Us. Mark, I want to start with you. This seems like it could have been avoided, obviously, if they had just put a seatbelt on this human being named Mr. Cox. New Haven City and police officials have pledged to make changes after this incident. But are there any policies and procedures that will prevent these outcomes? Because it seems to me you're making a conscious effort not to put the seatbelt on this human being when you probably wouldn't have done that for someone else, whether it's a rule or not.
Yeah, it's definitely avoidable, and there are just some basic tenets in law enforcement established that deal with the respect and the humanity of others, and in essence, sort of like a Hippocratic oath, do no harm. But more directly to this particular case, there's been significant changes as a result of past incidents, most namely George Floyd, and there have been some reforms that have been instituted in Connecticut, and one of those is the duty for police officers to render medical aid, and that speaks directly to what occurred here. But I think what's most important is not any of these kind of codified issues, but rather a clear, substantive respect of humanity, which is too often absent in these cases involving Black and brown people specifically, and the police.
I'm sensing some themes this week as we talk about the respect for bodily autonomy and human dignity. And Mark, just a follow-up to this in terms of the outcome here. The police officers have been placed on paid leave, and the assistant police chief from the New Haven Police Department said that the officer involved in this specific incident did not call for medical assistance. I mean, what do you think should happen next? Who should be held accountable here in terms of what happened to this young man? I mean, it's just horrible to think about the fact that he's on a ventilator now because of the actions and inactions by these police officers.
All police officers, all these professional police officers who were involved in this chain of custody of Mr. Cox should be held responsible for his care. And that goes from on the scene, the interactions initially when he was placed under arrest, from the first time when he indicated that he needed some medical assistance, he was ailing, they had a responsibility and obligation. And according to the reforms that they enacted in 2020, a duty to render medical aid. So all professional police officers from that point forward should be held fully accountable for these injuries.
Important points about the changes in policy post George Floyd. Professor, why does it seem that this happens over and over and over again? Again, as I said with in the top here, it doesn't feel like this is going to be solved by a rule book or a police handbook. This is deeper than that.
I think you're absolutely right. It goes to the heart of how Black and brown people are valued, are perceived, and treated. In this instance, Randy Cox was not served and protected. The police didn't act in that way, even as he was under their custody. There's something familiar about this, eerily familiar, that harkens back to Freddie Gray. Some of us know about this tactic of putting people in vans and driving around and bouncing them all over the place. We've had some friends who've had to go through this, as it were. So, you know, the call to reform policing in this country didn't end because there was an uptick in violence. It didn't end just because there's an uptick in crime. The call to reform policing in this country still needs to be heard, and it still needs to be pursued, it seems to me.
One of the other pieces of news, Eddie, is that in the 1955 case, with the murder of Emmett Till. Of course, everybody knows if they've read a history book, 14-year-old black boy who was abducted and lynched in Mississippi after being accused falsely of offending a white woman in her family's grocery store. So now a team's searching the basement of a Mississippi courthouse. I mean, I can't wait to see the movie of this, but they were in the basement looking through records, and they found evidence, an unserved warrant charging a white woman with his kidnapping. And Emmett Till's family, they do want this warrant served. I mean, what is the significance of this news? And in a lot of ways, I feel like these two stories are related. That's why we're talking about them together, because we have to link the present to the past here.
You know, sometimes there are folks who don't believe us. Even if you have video footage, they still don't believe. They think this isn't systemic. This is just simply bad apples. We have an idea of the deeply racist nature of policing in Mississippi in the context of the mid-20th century. We have an idea of how violent Mississippi was. Here is a tangible piece of material evidence of how the police were in some ways in cahoots with the people who tied that fan around Emmett Till's neck and threw him in the Tallahatchie River. It's material evidence. The family deserves justice, and the country needs to understand that we are in some ways responsible for what happened to that young man so many years ago.
And I just want to remind everybody, there is no statute of limitations on murder. It's one of the things that I think people are going to learn maybe in the coming days, because the woman in this case, she is now in her 80s, but she might be getting a call from law enforcement. Mark Claxton and Eddie Glaude, Professor, thank you so much for joining us today. And please stay safe, both of you. Hi, I'm Zerlina Maxwell. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more from Zerlina by clicking any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thanks for watching.